The road was long and winding, disappearing into the endless stretch of towering pines. Rachel glanced at the faded map spread across the passenger seat, tracing the dark lines that led her deeper into the heart of nowhere. The house was supposed to be close, tucked away in the thick woods on the outskirts of town, but with each passing mile, her nerves tightened, coiling into a knot in the pit of her stomach. This place had called to her. Now, as the last bit of daylight faded and the forest closed in around her, she wondered why. She pulled the car into the narrow gravel driveway, the tires crunching over stones as the house finally came into view. It stood tall and solitary, silhouetted against the dimming sky. Its dark windows were like eyes staring down at her, and the roofline sagged under the weight of decades, perhaps centuries. The Victorian structure was all sharp edges and looming shadows, its paint weathered and peeling in jagged strips. Vines crawled along the sides like skeletal fingers reaching toward the upper floors. Rachel stepped out of the car, inhaling the crisp, cool air, her breath visible in the early autumn chill. She shivered, but it wasn't just from the cold. The isolation was immediate, oppressive. No neighbors, no streetlights, just the house, the trees, and the overwhelming silence that swallowed everything else. She approached the front door, key trembling in her hand. As it slid into the lock, there was a faint creak from the nearby woods, a rustling, like something moving through the underbrush, but she saw nothing. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to calm down. It's just the wind. The door groaned open, its rusty hinges protesting after years of neglect. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. The hallway stretched long and dark, illuminated only by the thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the cracked windows. The wooden floors creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside, her shoes leaving faint impressions in the layer of dust that coated the ground. As she moved through the house, Rachel's eyes scanned the furniture covered in ghostly white sheets. Antique chairs, old wooden tables, and portraits of grim-faced strangers stared down at her from the walls. The house was a relic, untouched by time yet haunted by it. She set her suitcase down by the staircase and took a deep breath, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had followed her since she'd arrived. This was supposed to be her fresh start. After everything that had happened, after him, she needed this. She needed to feel in control again, to feel free. And this house, as strange and lonely as it seemed, was a chance for that. Rachel wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The kitchen was old-fashioned, with heavy iron fixtures and a large stone fireplace that looked as though it hadn't been used in decades. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, and the windows were streaked with grime, casting strange, distorted shadows across the floor. She paused in front of the basement door. It was a thick wooden thing, with deep scratches etched into its surface, as if something, or someone, had desperately tried to claw their way out. Rachel stared at it for a moment, a chill running down her spine, but she quickly brushed it off. She was being ridiculous. It was just an old house. Old houses creak. Old houses have history. Yet, as she moved away, she could have sworn she heard something faint. A whisper, perhaps, so soft it could have been the wind, or maybe not. She shook her head. Stop it. It's nothing. That night, as she lay in bed, the silence seemed too loud, too complete. The house settled with the occasional groan, the old beams shifting with the cooling night air. But beneath that was something else. A low murmur, almost imperceptible, like voices speaking just below the range of hearing. Rachel sat up, holding her breath, straining to listen. Nothing. The wind outside whistled softly through the trees, and for a moment, she relaxed. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, As she sank back into the pillow, there it was again, the faintest whisper, as though someone were standing at the foot of her bed, murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. She bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling in the darkness. No response. The house seemed to hold its breath, the silence thick and expectant. She stared into the shadows, her eyes wide, scanning the room. Nothing moved, no figures, no shapes, only the faint outline of the furniture and the eerie glow of the moon through the curtains. Rachel forced herself to lie back down, pulling the covers tightly around her. It's nothing, just nerves, the stress of moving, of being alone in an unfamiliar place. It was all in her head. But sleep didn't come easy. The shadows danced in her peripheral vision, flickering just out of reach, and the whispers, those cursed, quiet whispers, continued, growing louder as the hours stretched on. She tossed and turned, her mind fraying as the night wore on, until she finally drifted into a restless, dreamless sleep. Morning came, and with it a hollow sense of relief. The sunlight poured through the windows, banishing the shadows that had haunted her through the night. Everything seemed normal. The house, so menacing under the cloak of darkness, now appeared calm, almost welcoming in the pale light of day. She laughed at herself, at the fear that had gripped her the night before. It was just an old house, full of creaks and groans. Nothing more. Rachel moved through her morning routine, trying to shake off the lingering unease. As she headed toward the kitchen, she noticed something odd. The basement door. It was slightly open, the sliver of darkness beyond it seeming to pulse with a strange energy. Her hand hesitated on the knob. She was certain she had closed it the night before. Hadn't she? The memory was foggy, blurred by exhaustion, but she was almost positive. She pushed the door closed with a quick, firm motion and turned away, refusing to give it another thought. But as she walked away, the whisper returned, faint and distant, barely brushing her consciousness. And it was calling her name. Rachel's days in the house became a blur of mundane routines and mounting tension. She busied herself with small tasks, cleaning, unpacking the few belongings she had brought, and exploring the house's many rooms. Yet no matter how hard she tried to ground herself in the normality of her new life, a feeling of unease clung to her like a shadow, always just out of sight but never entirely gone. It was in the silence of the long, dim hallways, the heavy stillness of the rooms, and the ever-present sense that she was being watched. The whispers persisted, too. They came at the oddest times, when she was washing dishes, folding laundry, or simply sitting in the small library with a book she couldn't concentrate on. They were faint, almost too quiet to hear, but they were always there, brushing against the edge of her awareness, as though someone, or something, was trying to speak to her from the dark corners of the house. At first, she convinced herself it was just the old pipes creaking, or the wind slipping through the cracked windows. But then, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. They weren't just random noises. They were words, murmured conversations that Rachel could never quite make out. On the fourth night, the whispers escalated. It started just after midnight. She had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, fighting off the unease that had settled deep in her chest. The house was too quiet, the air too thick. And then, in the silence, she heard it. Her name, faint but unmistakable. "Rachel!" She bolted upright, her heart hammering. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale sliver of moon that slipped through the window. Her eyes scanned the shadows, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. only the quiet hiss of the wind outside and the steady thud of her pulse in her ears. And then it came again, closer this time, more insistent. "Rachel." The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but it filled the room, wrapping around her like a cold draft. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor as she stood, listening. "I'm imagining this," she thought. "I'm just tired." But as she moved toward the door, the voice called out once more, low and guttural, from somewhere below her. From the basement. Rachel froze, her hand on the doorframe, staring down the long, dark hallway. The basement door was at the end of the corridor, standing in shadow. She felt a pull toward it, a strange compulsion to move closer, to follow the voice that was calling to her from the depths below. She took a step, and then another, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she inched down the hallway, the wood creaking underfoot. When she reached the door, she hesitated. It was shut tight, as it had been earlier, but she could feel something on the other side. A presence, something old, something waiting. Her fingers hovered over the knob, but she couldn't bring herself to turn it. Her heart pounded in her chest, a deep, primal instinct screaming at her to turn around, to run back to her room and lock the door. Instead, she backed away, her pulse racing, and retreated to the safety of her bed, forcing herself to breathe slowly. She didn't sleep that night. The voice didn't return, but the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something unseen, clung to her for hours, long after the sun had risen. The following day, Rachel resolved to investigate the house's history. She hadn't planned to get involved in the town's local legends, but her curiosity, tinged with growing fear, pushed her to seek answers. She headed into the small village, hoping to learn more about the property and the family that had once lived there. The village wasn't much, just a scattering of old shops and weathered houses. At the general store, she approached the clerk, an older woman with sharp eyes and a pinched expression. Rachel introduced herself, explaining that she had recently moved into the old house just outside of town. The woman's face paled immediately, her eyes widening ever so slightly. "That house?" she asked, her voice low. "The one in the woods?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, I was hoping to learn more about it, about the family who lived there before." The woman's gaze darkened, and she glanced over her shoulder as though expecting someone to be listening. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said in a near whisper. "It's not safe." Rachel frowned, the knot in her stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" The clerk hesitated, wringing her hands. "The family? Years ago, they lived in that house. The Hawthorne family. No one talks about them much anymore, but people say they vanished, just disappeared. No one ever found out what happened to them." A chill ran through Rachel, though she tried to keep her voice steady. "Disappeared?" The woman nodded grimly. "One night, they were just gone. Some say they left, ran off in the middle of the night. Others think, that something darker happened. There were strange things about that house, even before they moved in. People say it's cursed." Rachel's throat tightened. "Strange things? Like what?" The woman looked her dead in the eye, her voice barely above a whisper. "People heard voices, saw things moving in the shadows, and the girl, the daughter, she talked about someone in the house, someone no one else could see." Rachel returned home that afternoon with the woman's words echoing in her mind. The house felt different now, heavier, as though it had been holding its breath while she was gone. She moved through the rooms with a sense of growing dread, the familiar creaks and groans of the floorboards, now taking on a more sinister tone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was plunged into darkness once more, Rachel found herself drawn to the attic. She had avoided the small, cramped space since moving in, but something compelled her now. She climbed the narrow stairs, her flashlight beam slicing through the dust-filled air. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, yellowed newspapers, and forgotten relics from a life long past. But something else caught her eye. A small, leather-bound book resting on a table in the corner, half buried under a pile of debris. Rachel picked it up, her fingers brushing the faded cover. It was a diary, belonging to a girl named Isabel Hawthorne, the daughter of the family that had once lived here. She opened it, flipping through the brittle pages. The early entries were innocuous enough, descriptions of daily life, the weather, and her parents. But as Rachel read further, the tone of the entries shifted. The words became frantic, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "There's something in the house with us. I can hear it at night. It whispers to me." Rachel's blood ran cold as she read the next line. "It says it wants me to stay. It says it will never let me go." That night, the whispers were louder than ever, insistent, filling every corner of the house with their low, rasping calls. Rachel lay in bed, clutching Isabel's diary to her chest, her mind spinning. She wasn't alone in this house. She had never been alone. The whispers weren't just random noises in the walls. They were voices, and they wanted something from her. The house had her now. Rachel had always known something wasn't right about it, but now she could feel its grip tightening around her mind, twisting her thoughts, warping her sense of reality. The days blurred together, time losing its meaning as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The voices were no longer confined to the dark hours of the night. They followed her everywhere, into every room, every corner of the house. They spoke to her in snatches, never forming full sentences, but always leaving behind a deep, suffocating sense of dread. You have to finish it. Complete what was started. It's waiting, watching. Rachel stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the knife in her hand, her mind unraveling. She had no memory of picking it up. It was just there in her grip, the blade reflecting the cold, dim light from the window. The whispers droned in her ears, a ceaseless, maddening hum that seemed to echo inside her skull. She placed the knife down on the counter and backed away, her heart racing. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls tightening, the floor creaking beneath her weight as if it were alive, breathing. Every step felt like walking deeper into a trap she couldn't escape from. She wanted to leave, to run far from this place, but something kept her tethered. Every time she thought of leaving, her feet refused to move. Every time she tried to unlock the front door, her hands shook and a paralyzing terror overwhelmed her. And every time she attempted to start the car, the engine would sputter and die, the forest outside looming larger and darker, as though it too had grown aware of her presence. One night, when the whispers became unbearable, Rachel found herself standing at the basement door again. She had avoided it for days, maybe weeks. Time had lost its structure here, but now she was drawn to it as if by some unseen force. Her hand hovered over the knob, fingers trembling. She didn't want to go down there. The air around the door felt heavy, thick with an unseen energy, and her gut screamed at her to turn back. But the whispers didn't allow her to retreat this time. Downstairs. You must go downstairs. She twisted the knob, the door creaking open slowly, revealing the yawning blackness below. Rachel hesitated at the top of the staircase, the smell of damp earth and rot seeping up from the depths. She fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, the basement light had never worked. Steeling herself, Rachel descended, one step at a time, the old wooden stairs groaning under her weight. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls of the stairwell, amplifying the silence that followed. The cold, damp air clung to her skin as she descended further, each step feeling heavier, like she was being swallowed by the darkness. At the bottom, the basement stretched out before her, a cavernous, unfinished space filled with forgotten relics of the past, broken furniture, old trunks, and boxes covered in thick layers of dust. But it was the far corner that drew her attention. There, shrouded in shadows, stood the ancient stone altar she had seen before. It seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, the jagged edges of the stone stained with something she didn't want to think about. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had found this altar before, but in her daze, she had blocked it from her memory, trying to push away the strange, half-formed images that haunted her dreams. Now, though, there was no turning away from it. The altar was calling her, pulling her forward with an invisible hand, the whispers louder than ever in her ears. It's time to finish it. Rachel moved toward the altar, her legs trembling beneath her. The stone surface was cold, smooth, and dark, like a relic from some ancient, forgotten ritual. Carved into the surface were strange, twisted symbols that matched the ones she had seen in Isabel's diary, symbols that didn't belong in this world. Her hands moved of their own accord, tracing the carvings, her fingers numb to the touch. She didn't know what she was supposed to do, but something inside her, some buried primal instinct, guided her. It was as though she had done this before, like some forgotten part of her had always known this moment would come. Suddenly, her vision swam. She was no longer in the basement. She was in the house, but not as it was now. Everything was brighter, alive. The walls were freshly painted, the floors polished. She could hear the laughter of children, the soft hum of conversation. And there in the distance she saw her, a young girl with dark hair and wide, frightened eyes. Isabel. Rachel's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. Isabel stood in front of the altar, her small frame trembling with fear, as her family, the Hawthorns, gathered around her. They were chanting softly, their voices low and reverent, as if they were praying to something far beyond human understanding. The whispers in the air around Rachel grew louder, more chaotic, as though they were desperate to reach her through the veil of the past. And then she understood. The Hawthorns had tried to perform the ritual. They had tried to rid themselves of whatever dark presence had infested their lives, but they had failed. And in their failure, they had bound the house and themselves to this curse, trapping their souls within its walls for eternity. Rachel blinked, the vision dissipating as she was pulled back into the present. Her hands were cold, trembling as they rested on the altar. The whispers in her mind began to take shape, forming clear, distinct words now. You must finish what they could not. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization sank in. The whispers had been guiding her all along. They weren't trying to destroy her. They were trying to use her. She was the key, the missing piece, the final act in a ritual that had begun decades ago. Rachel stepped back from the altar, her breathing shallow and quick. She stumbled against a pile of debris, knocking over a dusty trunk. As it crashed to the ground, the old lock snapped open, revealing its contents. A pile of ancient brittle documents and something else. An old ceremonial dagger, its blade still sharp despite its age. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the weight of the dagger heavy in her grip. The cold metal seemed to pulse with a life of its own, sending shivers up her spine. The whispers surged, louder now, more urgent. "You know what you have to do. It's the only way." Rachel felt her mind splitting in two, one part screaming for her to run, to leave this cursed place behind and never look back, while the other, darker part of her urged her forward. The whispers coiled tighter around her thoughts, wrapping her in their madness, pulling her closer to the inevitable. She looked down at the dagger in her hand, and then at the altar, its dark surface waiting for her. Finish it. The whispers were deafening now, filling the basement with their unnatural hum. She could barely hear her own thoughts over the noise. Her body moved without her consent, her feet dragging her forward, back toward the altar. As Rachel stood over the stone, dagger raised, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her, an endless cycle of death and torment. But in that moment, something shifted within her, a cold realization cutting through the haze of madness. The ritual wasn't to free the house. It was to trap her. In the reflection of the dagger's blade, she didn't see herself. She saw Isabel's terrified face staring back at her, and then everything went dark. The house was alive. It breathed, its ancient walls pulsing with a rhythm too slow, too deep for Rachel to fully comprehend. The whispers were no longer distant. They were everywhere, all around her, within her, filling the very air she breathed. They were no longer trying to convince her of anything. They were commanding her now. She stood in the basement, drenched in cold sweat, the dagger still clutched in her trembling hand. The stone altar loomed before her like a gaping mouth, waiting, expectant. Her vision swam, her thoughts muddled. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her, suffocating, but somehow, in the deepest part of her, it felt inevitable. She had always been meant for this moment. "You have to finish it." The voice, sharper now, more insistent, cut through the din of whispers. It was louder than the others, more familiar. Rachel closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, but when she opened them again, she wasn't alone. Isabel stood before her, not the fragile, frightened child Rachel had seen in her visions, but a woman, older, with a face that mirrored Rachel's own, twisted by grief and something far darker. Her eyes were wide, glassy, hollowed out by centuries of torment. Rachel stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. The apparition didn't move, but its presence filled the room, pressing in on Rachel from all sides. "This is what you wanted," Isabel's voice was a low rasp, filled with bitterness. "What you've always wanted." Rachel shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I never wanted this." Isabel's face twisted in a cruel smile. "You did. You always have. You just don't remember." Rachel's pulse raced, her heart pounding in her chest as the world around her seemed to distort. The room flickered, shifting from the dark, decaying basement to a bright, warm room filled with sunlight. She saw herself, or rather, Isabel, sitting at a small table, laughing with her family, the sound of their voices filled with joy and innocence. But then, just as quickly, the scene shifted. The light was gone. The room was the same, but it had been swallowed by shadows. The family was there, but they were no longer laughing. They were screaming, trapped in a moment of terror that never seemed to end. Isabel's face twisted in pain, her eyes wide with fear as the whispers surrounded them, louder, more violent. Rachel stumbled back, gasping for breath, her mind spinning with fragments of memory that weren't her own. It was all coming back now, Flashes of another life, another time, a life she had tried so hard to forget. "You were always meant to come back," Isabel's voice hissed, her form shifting between the girl she once was and the twisted reflection Rachel had seen in the mirror. "We've been waiting for you, all of us." The shadows in the room seemed to move with a life of their own, swirling around her, shapes forming out of the darkness. The hawthorns, every one of them, stood there now, their faces contorted in eternal agony. But they weren't looking at Isabel. They were looking at her. Because Rachel wasn't just like Isabel. She was Isabel. She staggered back, her mind screaming in protest, but the truth was undeniable. She had lived this life before, and before that, and before that. Each time drawn back to this cursed house. Each time reliving the same nightmare, trapped in an endless loop of suffering. This wasn't her first life, or her first death. She had been here, always, caught in the house's web, always meant to complete the ritual that had gone unfinished for centuries. "No," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not her. I'm not..." But she was. Isabel's memories were her own. The pain, the fear, the regret. It all belonged to her. "You can't run from this," Isabel said, her voice cutting through the fog. "You never could." The shadows pressed in closer, suffocating, choking. The whispers reached a fever pitch, drilling into Rachel's skull, urging her toward the altar. "Finish it." Her hand shook as she raised the dagger, her vision blurring as the weight of her past lives crushed down on her. The voices were right. She couldn't escape this. She never had been able to. The ritual had to be completed. It was the only way to break the cycle, to end the torment that had bound her soul to this cursed place. But as she stared down at the altar, the cold stone glowing faintly beneath her, something shifted inside her. A flicker of doubt, of defiance. What if this wasn't the way out? What if completing the ritual didn't free her, but trapped her forever? Her breath hitched as the thought pierced through the haze of whispers. What if this was all a lie? What if the house had manipulated her from the beginning, drawing her back life after life, forcing her to repeat the same mistake over and over? The whispers grew frantic, as if sensing her hesitation. "Do it!" Isabel's voice was a shriek now, filled with fury and desperation. "Finish it! Free us!" But Rachel hesitated, her grip on the dagger faltering. Her mind raced, the fragments of memory swirling in chaos. Finish it. But at what cost? The room around her seemed to pulse, the shadows closing in tighter, the voices louder, more demanding. She could feel the house tightening its grip on her, pulling her toward the final act. But then, in the cacophony of noise, a single thought broke through. What if not finishing it was the only way to break free? Her hands trembled as she stared down at the dagger. The whispers screamed in her ears, but she took a step back from the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so many lifetimes believing this was the only way, believing she had to complete the ritual to escape. But what if the only way out was to refuse, to deny the house what it wanted? "No," Rachel whispered, the word barely audible above the roar of voices. "I won't." The air in the room seemed to shift, the weight of the house pressing down on her like a physical force. The shadows writhed, the figures of the hawthorns screaming silently, their faces twisted in agony. Isabel's eyes burned with hatred, her form flickering in and out of existence as the house tried to hold her together. "You have to finish it!" Isabel's voice was a desperate wail now, her face contorted in rage. "You have to..." "No!" Rachel's voice was stronger this time, her grip tightening on the dagger. I'm not doing this. Not again. She threw the dagger across the room. It clattered against the stone floor, the sound echoing in the heavy silence that followed. The shadows recoiled, the whispers falling silent for the first time since she had arrived. For a moment, everything was still. Then the house shuddered. The walls trembled, the floor beneath her feet quaking as though the very foundation of the building was collapsing. Rachel stumbled back, her heart pounding as cracks began to form in the walls, spreading like veins through the wood and stone. The house was coming apart. The shadows screamed, swirling around her in a frenzy as the very fabric of the place unraveled. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the weight of centuries pressing down on her as the walls began to crumble. But Rachel stood firm, her breath steady, her mind clear. She wasn't afraid anymore. The house couldn't control her. And as the ceiling began to collapse and the walls caved in around her, she felt it. Freedom. The curse, the cycle, was breaking. The whispers faded, the shadows dissolved into nothingness. And in the final moments, as the house fell apart around her, Rachel smiled. For the first time in centuries, she was free. The house was gone. Nothing remained but the broken foundation, overgrown with weeds, reclaimed by the forest. And Rachel, whoever she had been, was gone with it. Only the whispers remained,